Morning, everyone. Having sat in on the first session, I'm not quite sure how I fit with what everyone was saying before. I'm probably badged myself as a bit more of a skeptic than some of the people earlier, even though I spend most of my working life trying to get people to think about impact. I've kind of seen this kind of issue from different angles through my sort of career. So one is from a central government treasury point of view, because that's one place I worked in for quite a long time. From the local government aspect, I ran a local government think tank at one point, and now from the charity sector, voluntary sector point of view, about how they find things, and I'll try and kind of bring in some of those perspectives as we go along. Just sort of first thing, just to say a little bit about MPC. If you've not heard of this, New Philanthropy Capital, our mission, we're a charity, is to transform the charitable sector, essentially by trying to get it think much harder about its social impact. On the whole, in the charity sector, people are moved to get involved in charities because they've got a heart, passion, they care about something. They're a bit less good on the question, yeah, but are you actually achieving anything, and could you have achieved a bit more if you thought about it a bit more? So that's what we're trying to do, and we push that at the charities, at funders, and at the sector. So we work with charities quite a lot on theories of change and measurement frameworks and so forth. We much harder actually influencing charitable funders to care about impact, philanthropists and charitable foundations, corporate foundations, and then we try and get the sector to work together occasionally, which would be nice because you can have more impact that way, and then we try and bring them all together. So that's kind of what we do, and we do end up working quite a lot on commissioning because it matters an awful lot to a lot of charities. I think the key point I want to kind of leave you with, and this obviously came out in the first session, is that we do need to measure social impact. There's some debates about exactly how. But ultimately, if we're to allocate resources correctly, we've got to get some kind of badge on this. I mean, it's always an issue. When you're working in government and you're spending money, you are trying to balance an outcome, which may be a desirable outcome, against an increased cost. How do you balance that if you haven't got some kind of assessment of what social impact you're actually creating? And this whole issue has become more of an issue in the charity sector, for instance. You do have at least some philanthropists and foundations thinking about this, and charities. If you listen to the last part of Matthew Taylor's 3-part radio programme on charities, last one went out on Friday, he's talking to quite a lot of charities about all this. And so that's kind of found its way into the voluntary sector. Business, as we've heard, is thinking quite a lot more about these kind of issues. I would say that some of them are just sort of thinking it as an added extra. You know, it'd be nice if we did something on financial inclusion because it goes down well in the tender or something, makes our staff feel good. Whether it's really transformed what they're doing, whether they're doing it well, etc., are other questions. It's interesting, we've come across this quite a lot. We do a lot of work in impact investing, which was referred to a bit earlier. And there's a question about impact investing, which is essentially people trying to invest for profit, for market returns, but they also want a social return. And there's a very big question about whether they really are getting any social return, and whether it's just what was known in the environmental world as greenwash, and we've started to talk about impact wash, making people feel good, yeah, hey, I'm getting market return, but I'm doing great socially good things. Are you really? And how can you know unless you're doing some kind of measurement? So that says that we've got to be trying to measure social impact. Obviously, this is a difficult issue. How do you do it? And in a sense, at a broad level, the challenge is I think that commissioners and others who are sort of paying people to do things often don't ask or care about it really. Whatever they say, and this includes in the charitable sector, they're often much more interested in the price than anything else. The providers, particularly charities, but all of them often just don't know, haven't really thought about it. Certainly in the charity sector, very few people got motivated to join the charity sector because they wanted to spend their life measuring their impact. They just wanted to do good and see people smiling and all that kind of stuff. And of course, because this stuff is hard. And I'm just going to run through some of the issues about measuring impact. Some of them will be very familiar to you, but I think it's worth reminding ourselves of why it's so difficult. First set of issues are to do with technical issues about attribution. So how do you know that you made the difference to the kids that you mentored and now get a job? There's issues as well about how much measuring impact costs. That particularly matters to the social sector. We have a world, one of the problems of pushing the social impact agenda is we have a whole set of people now who are doing social returns on investment, £1 in, 27 back. You only have to look at them very briefly to see that most of them are rubbish. And they've misled people, and there's become competitive people. Some academics in the Third Sector Research Centre have talked about SROI inflation, that now it's no good saying £1 in, we got £2 back, because somebody else will say, ha, but we got £5 back. So you keep going on and on. There's issues because a lot of people are looking for interventions, particularly in local authorities, public sector, that have cashable savings and produce better lives, but of course not all things have cashable savings. And we have a big timescale problem that anything worth doing, working with particularly vulnerable people, will take time to actually deliver. And the time horizons often of commissioners, or of lots of other people actually, is that they would like to see some results very quickly, particularly in terms of cashable savings, but even if not in cashable savings, then in results. And that's becoming an issue. And there's an issue about what is proportionate, which in a sense we were discussing a bit earlier. How much should you do this? How much should you invest in it? What is good enough? What is complete nonsense? And so on. So these things are tricky. We try to put out publications, kind of thing we do in our think tank work, about how you might go about measuring your impact. We've done stuff on economic analysis. And I think that certainly within the social sector, things are getting better. And of course, these are all relevant to the way government and private sector can go about these things as well. You do have then an issue about the level of evidence that you are going to want. If you like, if we were sort of academic evaluators, you know, we'd all sort of dream about going way out on the left there. Randomised controlled trials really do tell you, to some degree, whether you're having an impact or not. They're rather difficult, actually, in social policy. They don't necessarily tell you that something that's, even if it's been RCT'd in one place and it worked, will work somewhere else. And we've got lots of examples of that. A lot of people end up, and it sounded to me like some of the businesses were doing that, where they're a bit more up this end, which is some nice stories and some case studies and all the rest of it. Good qualitative evidence is useful. Anecdotes that are not reflective of really what of the population you're working with are not. And of course, even when you get into all of this, I think something is often missed out. You may show you're having an impact, a good social impact. There is a question about how much does that impact cost. If you throw enough money at something, you can probably have an impact. In fact, it'd be pretty surprising if you didn't. But the question is, was that money well spent? Could you have had more of an impact if you spent it on another scheme or another provider and so forth? And so this all gets very hard, and you can see why, particularly in the public sector, procurement people find this very difficult. The minute you move outside price and things like track record of potential providers and so forth, you are into difficult territory, trying to work out the price per unit of social value and somehow balancing that against the price that's been offered for the contract. And that's without even getting into some of the things that we talked about earlier, that people will say, look, we'll not only do your contract, but we'll do this many volunteer hours, and we'll do this, that, and the other. How on earth do you value those, really? I mean, there's so many examples of companies who say, we do, you know, this is the value of our volunteer hours, and you discover that they're valuing the volunteer hours at the rate that the top lawyers are being paid in their lawyer job. In fact, you know, we've always got rather cross with the companies who've all got their staff volunteering in schools in East London, which is a nightmare for the schools. And if those guys were pretty well paid, all gave a sort of, you know, a bit of a contribution, the school could perhaps have employed another maths teacher, which would have been rather more useful. So there's lots of issues in that kind of thing. There are kind of ways within the social sector which and in government which are getting us more easily to some kinds of concept of impact. One, which we've done a lot of work on, is this data labs approach. This is basically trying to raise the issue about how do you follow people through time. So you have, let's say, a charity who works with a group of young people, let's say, and they think that what they're doing working with them means that they'll have better outcomes. And the question is, did they have better outcomes? And following people through time, which is what you've got to do, and that is a very difficult thing. The more vulnerable they are, the less likely they are to reply to your survey 2 years later, or even have the same mobile phone number or anything like that. Meanwhile, government actually has lots and lots of data on us, as does Facebook, but government has a lot as administrative data, and you can then use that data to answer questions about what happened to people over time, and also to set up control groups through, technically it's propensity score matching, but it doesn't matter what the technical jargon is. And there have been achievements through here. We've lobbied very hard for this kind of stuff, and remarkably we were successful in, of all places, the Ministry of Justice when Chris Grayling was the Secretary of State. And so there is a thing now, you can look it up, called the Justice Data Lab, which does just this. And so a lot of charities, public sector and private sector, have used it. And you say, here's the sort of 100 people we work with in prison, doing art with them or mentoring or whatever, and the data lab will tell you what happened to them a few years later. Did they reoffend or not? It's more sophisticated now, actually. It will tell you whether they reoffended in a more severe way, whether the frequency of reoffending changed, and it will compare it to a similar set of people who were prisoners, and it will give you some net effect. And it's been very powerful. Not surprisingly, it shows that in general, even very good organisations only reduce reoffending by a small amount, 2 or 3%. Whereas if you look at the evaluations they always did before, people used to claim a 40% reduction from taking music into a prison or something, which is always a bit unlikely. And at the minute, there's a lot of attempts to try and get this going in employment. There is a version in education, which the Education Endowment Foundation has been funding, and also in health. But if any of you work in health, you'll know trying to get data out of NHS Digital is one of the hardest things in life to do. So there's the point I'm trying to make here is there's some interesting ways of thinking about how we can get a handle on impact, which will be cheap, simple, use data that we've already got, so we don't have to survey everyone to death, which charities worry about as well. Do you really want to have to go and survey vulnerable people and so forth? The other thing which I think came out that I wanted to mention came out this morning, which is whether we want some completely different metrics, and this is GDP. Seems to go up. I know it's been a bit sticky recently, but basically goes up. Meanwhile, a measure of life satisfaction doesn't move at all, and surely this is what it's all about, life satisfaction. So shouldn't we be trying to measure everything we do, everything we're commissioning on this, not something like that? And that's kind of brought in this whole concept of Wellbeing. This is a bit of an ad because I'm on the board of the What Works Centre for Wellbeing, which is churning out a lot of stuff, and this is becoming a much more respectable kind of academic discipline at the moment. And very pleased to say that the revision of the Treasury Green Book, if any of you know what that is, that's the kind of Treasury Bible for how you should do appraisals, which I had a go at the version of that in the 1980s, shows I'm a bit ancient. But the latest version that's just come out does include wellbeing for the first time and suggests that people use it. So we can get at some of the things that people have always wanted to get at. We can get them at them more. So it's not totally impossible, and we should carry on being optimistic. I just want to then go on to talk a bit about commissioning and public sector commissioning. I mean, there was an argument that said in the old days, pre-Social Value Act, that procurement had to go for the cheapest, and somehow EU procurement laws made you do this. This was never true. Councils could always, and other public sector organisations could always have done basically what the Social Value Act lets them do. But the Social Value Act, to some extent, legitimises it, and to some extent mandates it as well. So it says that commissioners really ought to think about it. And I think that's a good thing. And as we've heard already, and I'm sure you'll hear from the speakers this afternoon, it is changing behaviours and thinking in the public sector and to some extent, interestingly, in the private sector. But just a few thoughts on it. I mean, I'm slightly concerned that it's got a bit simplistic, and it's been used, especially by a lot of councils, to be about biasing things towards local providers, and that sort of local content is the absolutely crucial thing. And that's because, if it's a local provider, it keeps the jobs and the income in the locality. That's the argument, and that this will be a very good thing. Whether that is true, whether it's a kind of slightly strange world that we're going to have lots of areas only or trying to commission only from organisations within their sort of boundaries, I think is debatable. But it shouldn't. The key thing is it shouldn't be the only thing that Social Value Act's about. And I also think the Social Value Act should be more about saying that we favour, let's say, an organisation bidding for some of our bus services, if they say, and we'll also throw in a dial-a-ride service, and therefore you say, oh, right, we'll give you the contract. I think that may be important, but those two things should not be the only thing about Social Value Act. And I'm saying this, I suppose, partly from the way we see the world through the charity sector. And what the charity sector worries about is, take an example, if there's let's say there was a tender, probably wouldn't be, but to run a youth club or something, and the charity is up against, I don't know, Serco Youth or something. Serco Youth is cheaper, but the charity says, we don't only run the youth club, but we know through the ways we do our interventions that those kids will have a better life. And that will be good for them, but also there's some evidence that there will be flowbacks, less expenditure on health and police and all the rest of it. And they want that taken into account when people are deciding who gets the contract. And that doesn't seem to us to be the way that the Social Value Act is being used at the moment. And instead, some of those other things that I talked about, to some extent, are a little bit more box-ticking. Now, the reason, one of the reasons is that this is very difficult for commissioners to judge those sort of things. How do you judge it in a consistent way? We've heard quite a lot about that. Do we need some standardisation? When we thought, when we responded to the Social Value Act consultation a couple of years ago, we were trying to think of some ways that would make this easier for commissioners. We also think, and we certainly pick up from the charities, that they feel that commissioners are often risk averse. And that moment where you give the contract to the higher price bidder, but you say it's because we think their social value is really good. If somebody challenges you and you say, why did you think that social value was so good? And what was the real evidence you had? And didn't you really just give it to them because they're a local charity and you rather like them? How would it stand up when you said, well, this was the evidence that we used? And therefore, we thought that it would be very helpful if government gave some kind of guidance without kind of saying you have to do it this way. So it would give some reassurance to people as to what they could do in terms of kind of what data and methodologies broadly would be acceptable, would sort of stand up in court, if you like. And we think that would help. But I know that kind of things are difficult. Are we making progress? I mean, I thought there was a lot in the first session. I enjoyed it. It was very optimistic, that the world is changing, whether it's all due to the Social Value Act or something else. Millennials are different. Companies are all coming to social value. That's all they care about now. The bottom line's out the window. Commissioners really don't care about the fact they've got no budgets. They're just out there commissioning for social value. I'm afraid I'm a little dubious. And that's my sort of picture. Are we behaving? So we do hear about local government embracing the Social Value Act, and there's figures around about 70% of councils using it and so on. Doesn't, of course, mean 70% of contracts are going that way, nor does it mean that everyone is using it very well. From the voluntary sector perception, the Social Value Act use is very patchy, and they would still say, in their view, almost everything is decided on price. They find it very difficult to demonstrate short-term cash savings, to some extent because there aren't any from a lot of what charities do, and that local authorities, not surprisingly, have very short time horizons at the moment. They also, other things that worry them, that, because one argument, and there was an interesting, again, actually on that radio programme, about the Newcastle, the Leeds networks, which are kind of commissioned through sort of grants and so on, rather than contracts. But there's been a commissioner there for years. He knows the sector. He knows everybody. Charities say in most local authorities, in most health organisations, commissioners churn like mad. So the idea of building a relationship with them is crazy. And some charities, and you have a bit of a fight in the charity world between the big charities and the little charities. So the little charities don't like the fact that the big charities come in and win the contract. So Bernardo's will come in and they can bid well. And the bigger charities worry, particularly in some areas like public health, which are now decided to some extent politically by the council rather than NHS England, that there's a sort of tendency to want to favour locally important community groups. Shall I just put it like that? And that, that's kind of, you might say that's fine, but they worry that the real thing that should be is the contract should be given to whoever delivers the best service for the citizens, the vulnerable people, not necessarily just because you're locally based. I think there's an issue, and we've heard about that, and probably heard about it a bit more, that it's interesting because CLES in particular have worked with quite a lot of the kind of northern metropolitans. I mean, we're hearing a little bit about West Midlands and so forth, the mayor there, but doesn't have a lot of power, the West Midlands mayor. And it's interesting why it hasn't kind of spread further and whether CLES are going to take over the world soon. But I think that's a concern. And so last couple of slides, I mean, there's a question about whether we should be looking, I'm talking here just about the voluntary sector, to create social value with a different relationship between the public sector and the voluntary sector in terms of commissioning and so forth. And I've just got a couple of slides to finish off on that. One is just a sort of quote from a recent report on how to work effectively with the third sector that's done by some guys at Durham University. It's well worth a read. But their sort of pull-out quote, and TSOs is third sector organisations, and they're basically saying that third sector organisations want a different relationship with the public sector, not just a pure commissioning one. And in the paper, they argue that the public sector makes a mistake. It doesn't really get the best out of the third sector by just having a commissioning relationship. So I think that's quite interesting, worth thinking about. The other couple of quotes come from a recent paper by the King's Fund. So this is about health commissioning. And they kind of have tried to interview a lot of commissioners and what is their attitudes to the third sector. And this will probably be familiar to lots of you, but they come up with kind of two very, very different models. So they say that one set of commissioners basically do want to somehow see the voluntary sector as partners in trying to deliver health outcomes, and they want that kind of relationship with them. I would say there's not many of those. The rest of them basically just see them as another provider, and they can take their cue up in the commissioning process. And I think there's a big question here for local authorities in particular, because they're place-based, but true with health commissioners, probation, all the rest of it, about what kind of relationship do you want, and whether commissioning, whether you add social value into it at 20%, at 30%, and any other percent, really is the key thing, or whether you want to have a completely different relationship. So I think that the main thing going forward, I think this is an exciting agenda, and just to leave you with the last slide, which I always quite like, is I think we should be brave in all this area. We are doing new things. It's difficult. We had the debate about standardisation versus not, and complexity versus simplicity. This is difficult stuff, but it seems to me we're on the right journey, but we have to keep being brave, but not barking mad. Hope that's helpful.